Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Ministry Advisory Council webinar. I'm just so glad you're here, and welcome everyone who is watching this on the recording as well. Just a pleasure to host this from time to time. We do it about once a month, maybe sometimes once a quarter, depending on where we are in the year, and we're just really happy you're here. My name is Tim Lawrence. I'm the VP of the Ministry Development Group. I oversee the ministry relationships here at the credit union, and I get to host these sometimes with my co-host Paul Newberger, who is not here today. So I'm going to have to do this myself today. So he usually does the heavy lifting, so just bear with me as I try to muddle through this. Now today we've got Bob Dye from Good Shepherd Bookkeeping Solutions, who is going to talk to us about what churches and ministries need to do at the end of the year. It's going to provide all kinds of information for us, so we're really happy that he's here. Now, if you've got questions, one of the ways to get those questions into the loop is to use the chat feature of the webinar. So I'll be checking that as we go as well. And he's got quite a bit of information. So what we may do is hold most of the questions until the end, and then we'll do a question and answer at the end, and we'll go from there. Again, just before we get started and before I introduce Bob, I just want to start us in a quick prayer. So Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day and every day you give to us. We are just so grateful to you that we get to do this thing called life and this thing called ministry, where we hope to help you in advancing the kingdom, Lord. And that's what we're about here at the credit union. And that's what I'm sure everyone here is all about as well. So we just ask you to be with us today, be with Bob as he presents this information to us, and help us to learn what we can to make ministry more effective. And in your name we pray. Amen. Amen. So now I just want to introduce Bob. Now, Bob Dye has been in this business for quite a while. I think since 2018 was when Good Shepherd Bookkeeping Solutions, right? So it's been owner and founder of that company. Prior to that, Bob had been in ministry leadership for, I think, over 18 years, different roles, senior pastor, administrative pastor, as well as leading other nonprofits, several years of banking experience in the ministry space as well. So Bob brings a wealth of experience with him today, and I'm sure that his presentation will be packed with information that will be useful to you. And so I think at this point, I just want to turn it over to Bob and say, Bob, thanks for being here, and turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Tim, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And thank you to Christian Community Credit Union for hosting this, and gives some valuable information to ministries. And I'm excited to be here with all of you who are joining us today, and I look forward to a wonderful time together. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're just going to jump into it. I do have a lot of information here, and so we're going to get going. Let me do a couple of things here real quick, and hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. And we're good to go with the slides. So we are looking at a year-end financial checklist. So for ministries, I'm sure all of you are very aware that the end of the year creates a lot of tasks for you to do. And so sometimes it's hard to keep track of all of those tasks. And so we wanted to try to help you with that today, to explain a little bit about what are the things that you need to think about at the end of the year. And again, you may already be thinking about a lot of these, but sometimes things slip through the cracks and that kind of a thing. And so we want to jump into that. Why do we want to be concerned about year-end tasks? Well, I think, first of all, we want to ensure compliance for our ministries. You know, Scripture talks about how that we need to render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, and we need to also obey the governing authorities and those sorts of things. And so IRS rules and regulations and all that, it can become a bit daunting. I mean, those are things that ministries don't always have to think about or want to think about or want to have to deal with, but yet we do. And so there's some very practical things that we need to know and understand. So what we've tried to do is just bring that all together and kind of distill that a little bit for you and give you some information. The other thing is that I think by doing a review at the end of the year, it helps us with our stewardship, and also hopefully helps us in our planning going forward into 2025. So we trust and pray that this is a blessing for you. We're going to really focus on three major categories here. First of all, is we're going to talk about financial tasks. What are those things that you need to know and understand related to your bookkeeping and closing your books and some of those things, but also payroll taxes. There are some very specific things that we need to know and understand that need to be taken care of at the end of the year related to payroll. So what are those things? We're going to look at that. And then general administrative tasks, kind of more big picture things, and then we'll close up with that at the end. Now, there will be a lot of detail here, and so I want you to kind of relax and not feel like you have to take copious notes, because we are going to provide for you at the end an actual checklist. And so we're going to give you a website that and a link that you can go to. You can download a free PDF of a checklist that's going to have all of the major points. Feel free to take whatever notes that you want to, but I just want you to know we're going to give that to you at the end so that you will be able to print out a checklist for yourself. So hopefully that'll be a blessing to you. Well, let's go ahead and jump in, and got to do one thing here. There we go. So, whenever I start off a discussion like this, sometimes, you're tempted just to go right into the details. What are the things, the tasks that I need to know at the end of the year? But I like to back up a little bit and think big picture, because it's important for us to begin with the end in mind. And I didn't make that up. That comes from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But to think about big picture and to look at this a little bit. I just want to encourage all of you. You may have all kinds of different backgrounds, whether you're an executive pastor or a church administrator or a board treasurer, whatever your role is here, you are doing an important ministry. I've actually had pastors share with me different times, they feel like the financial side of things just isn't as important as real ministry, quote unquote. I tend to try to push back on that a little bit and say, this ministry is very, very important. This is a ministry, and it's an important foundation for any ministry to have and to do it well. Because if you don't have a strong foundation in the financial realm, then there's going to be a whole list of problems that can happen within a ministry. Not understanding how much money you have to spend, not taking care of compliance issues, not doing things well and orderly. And so all of those things play into it. So in order for a ministry, I believe, to function well, that this ministry, the ministry of financial care within the church and taking care of these details, is a very, very important ministry. So I think it's important, even on the finance side, for us to stop and celebrate some of the wins and blessings of the previous year. What has God been doing in your life personally? What has God been doing in your church? What has God been doing in your community? What are the amazing things that have happened, the baptisms, the folks coming to know Christ, folks growing in discipleship and those sorts of things, to just reflect on that and doing that even with your ministry team, I think is very, very important. But then also to take a little bit of time and think about, well, what didn't go well this year? What are some processes that maybe broke down, or some things that we could have done better? And to focus on those things and think about, okay, how can we do that better next year, and what kinds of things do we want to implement or even change? But then I think the third part here, this is crucially important, even as I shared about the financial side of ministry being an important ministry, and that being in congruence with the leadership team. I really encourage administrators and executive pastors to meet with the ministry teams and even with the board, or those that are going to be casting vision for the next year, to understand what that vision is, because you're going to be working on the budget. You're going to be working on all of the things that are going to help to facilitate that ministry. So I believe it's important for you to be an integral part of that decision-making progress as to where are we headed next year? What's God going to do? Where are we going to exercise faith in terms of what God would want us to do and to be in the coming year? So all of that's real important. But we're going to have a lot of nitty-gritty details here, but this is very, very important. So I just want to encourage you on the onset. You're doing an important ministry. Thank you for taking the time to dig into this. Thank you for what you are doing in your church. And I just want to encourage you in that. Of course, Proverbs 16:3 says, commit your work to the Lord and your plans will be established. So I think that's a great starting place there. Well, let's start to dig into some of the nitty-gritty details here. And we're going to start off, as I mentioned earlier, with the financial tasks. And so right up front is verify and reconcile all accounts. So, you know, you look at that and say, well, Bob, you know, I do. We already reconcile the bank accounts every single month, but I'm going to maybe stretch us a little bit on that and talk about some other accounts that we might want to make sure that we're reconciling and taking care of. Some ministries do, some ministries don't, uh, but you know, reconcile credit cards. And so one of the things that we recommend as a best practice is that you reconcile your credit cards as well as your bank account. So that may be a credit card account, that might be individual credit cards, but I think it's important to understand each and every transaction on your credit card and make sure those are legitimate transactions and then check those off with the bank statement. So in terms of how we do our bookkeeping for our clients, we do reconcile all credit cards. And so I think that's important in addition to your bank account. Also, it's important to reconcile your loans and make sure that the interest and the principal are calculated correctly, but also categorized correctly in your book. So that's important. And then again, not again, but then also petty cash. So you want to make sure that you are reconciling your petty cash minimally once a year. Hopefully you're doing it at least quarterly. Petty cash is kind of going by the wayside in the church world a little bit. It's more based on, you know, purchases are based on credit cards and that sort of a thing. But if you do have a petty cash fund, you want to make sure that that is reconciled. All of the transactions are recorded for the end of the year. Another thing as it relates to reconciling all accounts or reconciling your donor restricted and board designated funds. And this is important because you may have, you know, let's say 5 donor restricted funds. You want to make sure that all of the proper transactions have been recorded successfully. You want to make sure that the income has hit those donor restricted funds as well as the expenses coming out, and all of that is verified and looks good. Another thing that we hit on this too is you want, you know, even on your bank accounts, you want to go back and look at 2 things. You want to look at uncategorized expenses, and you also want to look at anything that has not been reconciled from many months ago. We primarily use QuickBooks Online, and many of you may use the Outer QuickBooks Desktop, and so you can go back and look at your transactions that have not been reconciled. And so sometimes, you know, you can go back to April or June or September, and there might be a few transactions that are just kind of sitting there. And we have seen where that can carry over for years and years and years with certain ministries, but it's important to deal with those by the end of the year. And why is that? Well, because it really does affect your financials. It affects your statement of activity or your P&L. Those expenses will show up there. And so if they're not legitimate expenses or they're a duplicate or something like that, you want to make sure to clear those out. So that's very important to clear all unreconciled transactions. And then if you have an uncategorized transaction line item on your P&L and there's something sitting in there, you want to make sure to categorize those into the proper expense accounts at the end of the year. So it's just really a cleanup thing that you want to do. And then finally on this part, you really should look at having a policy to close out your books at the end of the year. And most financial softwares will allow you to enter in a password to be able to password protect the book. So in other words, you close out, let's say at the end of January, everything's done for 2024. You put in that password. If you have 2 or 3 people that are posting or going in and out of QuickBooks or your financial software, then you can put that password there so it doesn't happen without your approval for that to happen, because you don't want things to change after you close your books. But that's just really best practice to close your books at the end of the year. The second thing, we're going to move on to prepare and send donor statements. Now, some of this might be redundant for you. Is okay, I know we need to do donor statements and all of that, but you know, I'd like to just cover a little bit about What are the parameters of donor statements? What are the things you need to know with donor statements to make sure that you're in compliance? First of all, donor statements are required for any individual that gives $250 or more. So what that means is if somebody attends one time, gives $20 as a check, that you're not required to send them a donor statement. Now, you certainly can. Most churches do send them out to anybody and everybody that gives a donation, but you're not required to do that. So it is definitely $250 and up that you are required to do that. Also, the donation must be sent no later than January 31st of the following year. That is an IRS regulation. Another thing on your statement is to make sure to indicate if you are a 501c3 corporation. Some churches will actually put their federal employer identification number. It's called a FEIN number. You're not required to do that part, but you do want to state if you're a 501c3 corporation, and you also want to make sure to state that no goods or services were provided for the gift. And so those are the important key elements. Let's talk about in-kind donations. We get a lot of questions about, well, how do I handle in-kind donations? And in-kind donations are when somebody goes and purchases something and then gives that item to the ministry, but they want a donation receipt and they want to be able to write that off on their taxes. So certainly you can do that as a church, but best practices for that is you can do a letter on your letterhead that simply says, thank you for your donation, but then list what the donation is. I like to use the example of, let's say it's a MacBook computer that they're going to give to you for your use. We wish, don't we, that someone might donate that. But if they do, you simply list that it was a 2024 MacBook computer. You do not put the amount. That is between the individual and the IRS as to what the amount was. Of course, they need to have the receipt to justify that. All you need to do is indicate what the item is, and then go ahead and do the other verbiage about being a 501c3 and that no goods or services were provided for this gift. And so then on the books, if you have something like a MacBook computer, you're probably going to put that into your fixed assets, and it's going to show up there, and then you do the depreciation schedule and all that. So you do want to book it on your books, either on an income section or a special in-kind donation section, and put a value there, or put the value of it in the fixed asset section. So hopefully that's helpful there. The other thing with donor statements I like to talk to churches about is to make sure that you include a letter. Most of you are probably already doing this, but some sort of end-of-year letter just saying thank you for your donations and looking back over the past year, and again, what the Lord has done in the last year and what you're looking to do next year to cast vision. And so I think that's a great time that you can communicate with your congregants and just say thank you for your donation, and then attach the donation statement there. Next up is reviewing and to review and adjust journal entries. And so there's certain things at the year end that you need to deal with sometimes and do some journal entries in order to correct some things that you might need to. Again, I go back to loan, interest, and principal. So sometimes churches will handle that each month. You have interest and you have principal. A lot of times churches, they want to know in the budget, how much is our mortgage costing us? Let's just use a number, $3,000. They like to put that in their budget, that $3,000 is going to go out each month. Obviously, that includes principal and interest. And so they put in their budget, mortgage payment all the way across. However, for it to be properly handled in your books, you need to tag the interest payments to your profit and loss or your statement of activity as an interest cost, but the principal needs to go to your long-term liabilities, which is where your loan principal is going to be. So that has to be separated. So what that means is at the end of the year, you're going to have to calculate all of the principal that was paid for all 12 months and all the interest that was paid. And so the interest would remain on your profit and loss statement, and the principal needs to go over to the long-term liability or the loan principal to reduce that loan principal. So that's important. Also, depreciation. You're going to need to do your depreciation entries if you're tracking depreciation, and also your accrued expenses. So there are things that you need to think through, what needs to have adjusting journal entries in order to stay current. Let's move on to the next page. We have review financial reports. Now, um, what is best practice with this is that you actually print out your balance sheet or your statement of financial position, as well as your profit and loss or your statement of activity, and then review those all of those statements. And a couple of things to look at in particular would be your payroll liabilities. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but under your short-term liabilities on your balance sheet, you're going to have all kinds of things there, like your Social Security and Medicare taxes, FICA. You're going to, for employees, you're going to have personal income tax. You might have benefits such as medical, dental, vision, or you might have retirement there. And so what's happening is there's amounts always coming in with every pay cycle into those payroll liabilities. And so there might be employer contributions or employee contributions, and then payments go out. And so over the course of a year, there can be little errors that happen there. It could be a couple of dollars or whatever it is. And so you want to review that to make sure that everything balances at the end of the year. Also, you want to make sure to look at your board restricted, donor designated, and also unrestricted funds. So best practice on your balance sheet is down at the bottom under net assets, that you want to split that out between unrestricted funds, in other words, what's available at any time for emergencies or for cash flow purposes or for spending. Then you have donor restricted funds. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later about donor restricted funds. But those are funds, obviously, that the donor has said it's for this specific purpose. And you want to make sure that, that those are tracked properly, and then also board designated funds. Now, what is the difference between donor restricted and board designated? Donor restricted is where the donor says it goes to a certain ministry or project or whatever that case may be. Board restricted or board designated is where the board says we're going to set aside X amount of dollars for a specific purpose. Now, donor restricted funds have to be used for that purpose. Board designated funds can be changed at any time by action of the board. In other words, they can unrestrict those funds and then use them for any purpose. And so that is an important differentiation. Now, actually, legally, and IRS regulations would say that if you have donor restricted funds, that all that amount has to be available in your bank account at all time. In other words, you can't dip into those funds for operations. And that's why it needs to be expressed separately so you know how much that is. So when you're looking at donor restricted funds and board designated funds and whatever that amount is, those should be amounts that are always available in your bank accounts. The unrestricted funds is what you have to be able to spend at any given moment. So it's important to express that. So that's why you want to review the financial reports. Make sure that when you're closing your books that things are expressed properly so that you're able to see that clearly. And it's just an easy thing to for your board to look at and to have that information at hand. All right, let's look at preparing the budget for next year. Last year, we did a webinar on preparing budgets. And so I think that's available on the CCCU YouTube channel if you want to go and check that out. But basically, there's a few things to know about budgets. Usually, it's best to start about 3 months prior to the start of the new fiscal year. Sometimes churches have a July 1 fiscal year, so you want to start in April. Hopefully, if you have a January 1 fiscal year, that you're already in the process of working on your budget. Budget forecasting is something that is very helpful when you go to prepare your budget. And how that basically works is that you can take your year-to-date financials, your profit and loss, and then you can express that by month, and you can download a CSV file. Then if you take the total amount year-to-date and basically divide it by 9, you have an average for each of your categories. So you'd have an average for your income, an average for all of your expenses. You can actually project out for October, November, and December by using those averages to fill out your initial take on your budget. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to be what your budget is finally, but you're able to review that information and have a starting place. And then you're going to want to adjust it. So maybe there was in the month of July, somebody gave an additional $100,000 gift that you know you can't rely on next year. You might want to take that out. Or on the other hand, there might be where you make two insurance or two payments to your insurance company for liability insurance, maybe one in March and one in September. So you want to make sure that that's captured in there as well. But it's a good starting place. And so then you take that to your leadership team, your finance committee, and you start to look at, okay, what do we think our income projections for next year are going to be? What are our expenses? And then, of course, it's very important to surround that with leadership to know what vision and what new initiatives in terms of ministry that you're wanting to do and how much is that going to cost, and of course put all of that into the equation as well. And so whenever you do all of that, and then you finally get to a place where maybe at the committee level or however your church does that structurally, you present the budget to the board, and then of course the board then makes the final decision and then approves the budget for the next year. Now, one key thing related to budgets is that you always have to remember that it's a target that you're aiming for. And we are not, churches are not created to serve the budget serves the church. And I always like to remind people of that, because sometimes we look at that, well, this is the document, it's set in stone, and if there's any variations, then we're just all messed up. But that's not the case. It is a target. We want to aim for it. It helps us to know how to spend over the next year, but allow it to serve you, and you don't have to serve it or make it this huge thing. But it is important to have. Every church should have a budget and know what they're going to be spending in the next year. Let's move on to audit and internal controls. This is really where you review some of your processes that you currently have happening surrounding financial issues and situations that arise. A good example would be Sunday counter teams. Do you currently have at least two people each week counting the offering, signing off on that? You may have a team of 5 or 6 people that rotate on different Sundays, that sort of a thing. But it's always good to check on that. You never want to have just one person counting the offering. That's a pretty basic thing. But look at that and make sure that your processes are in place there. Also, cash handling procedures. A lot of times churches deal with cash, whether it's youth groups or children's ministry groups, or it might even be if you're handling cash at a cafe or a church bookstore, that you need to have cash handling procedures. If you have even cash drawers or money boxes or those sorts of things, you want to have procedures on how those are counted and given to individuals and the responsibility to return them and that sort of a thing. The other key thing here as you look at auditing your internal controls is to have separation of duties. What do we mean by separation of duties? That means that the same person doesn't do everything. So if you have somebody that's doing the entry of the deposits and doing the entry of all of the expenses, that person should probably not be the person who reconciles the bank account. Now, I know and understand that staffing can be a little tight in churches, and sometimes it's like, well, I'm the financial person. Who else is going to do the reconciliations? I do the deposits. I do all of this, and I understand that. I do understand that there may not be a lot of staff to handle that, but you might want to think about getting your treasurer, your board treasurer involved, perhaps, and have them do the reconciliation, because it's always good to have a second set of eyes on the transactions that happen within a ministry. It's interesting because recently, on November 8th, in fact, there was a sentencing of a church employee that over several years had actually embezzled $330,000. And she was the only one handling everything. And how did it happen? It mainly happened through Venmo and Cash App accounts. So the church used Venmo and Cash App to receive donations, which, by the way, we do not recommend you do that. Use a better online platform like Planning Center or Tithely or something like that. But they were using that, but it was very easy for her to see that come in, and she would turn around and Cash App or Venmo herself some of that, but then post the others. So that happened for several years. to the tune of $330,000. So she got sentenced for 10 years or 10 years in jail, and also has to pay restitution. And so again, pray by God's grace that never happens in any of the churches represented here, but it is still good. That's why it's good to have another set of eyes on your books and on the transactions. And so separation of duties is an important thing. So I just want to encourage you with that. Then let's move on to filing your county, state, and federal reports. Many of you would be familiar with this, likely that there's certain things that you have to take care of once a year. I'm from California. That's where I'm based. And so I've served in churches in California for many years. And here, if you own a building and land, then you are exempt from paying property taxes. However, if you want that exemption, you have to fill out the necessary paperwork each and every year. So every January, you got to fill out, I think it's 2 forms you have to submit to your county to make sure that you still receive that tax exemption. So very important that you take care of that. Secondarily, you need to likely register your 501c3 with your state organization. In California, that's our Secretary of State. Every 2 years, a ministry is required to file a statement of information. Many of you likely know that and are in compliance with that, but if you're not, make sure that you have that. If you haven't renewed it for 5 years, then likely it's expired and you need to have that renewed. So make sure to renew that every 2 years. Some of you may have to deal with sales tax, state sales tax. And in California, if it's not that much, it would just be once a year you pay the sales tax. Sometimes if there's more sales, you might have a bookstore, let's say, or cafe where you need to charge sales tax. And if that's the case, then you may be paying that quarterly, but make sure that that's all calculated and sent into the proper authorities. And then there's also the IRS Form 990. We do get a lot of questions about that. Churches are not required to fill out an IRS Form 990 and submit it each year. However, religious nonprofits are. So if anyone here represents a religious nonprofit, such as, let's say, a pregnancy center or a homeless shelter or something of that nature, and if you're not organized as a church, then you are required to fill out an IRS Form 990 each year. Normally that's taken care of by a CPA, so you'd want to engage with the CPA to take care of that for you. All right, moving on to number 8. You want to do a fixed asset review. So I touched on this a little bit earlier. This is where we look at capitalization, depreciation policies. So any major purchase that you make through the course of the year, you need to review that and determine if you want to capitalize it. So let me just speak about the depreciation for just a couple of minutes, and I don't want to get too deep on this. But first of all, first and foremost, churches are not required to capitalize or depreciate their larger assets. Businesses are incentivized to do it because they can write off depreciation as a tax deduction. Well, churches are nonprofit. There's no taxes, so you don't have to do it. But I want to give you 3 reasons why you might want to think about doing it. The first reason is if you have a building loan and you work with a lender such as CCCU, it's going to be to your advantage to depreciate your assets because you can add depreciation back into your income to help you qualify for a loan or whenever your review comes up. So in that case, it is wise to go ahead and do depreciation. And then the second thing that you might want to look at is you want to look at the useful life of your assets. And a good example here is, let's say you have an HVAC unit that's worth $30,000, whatever it is. Well, that may have a 20, 25-year useful life, and you're seeing that on a spreadsheet, and you know you're coming up to the end of that time. Well, you need to have enough capital set aside to be able to buy another HVAC unit instead of panicking and figuring out where we're going to get the cash to buy this. But it helps you to manage the larger expenses, let's say sound equipment that you have to replace, or computer equipment for staff, any building maintenance kind of thing, that you can be watching that and knowing from a timing standpoint when those things are going to need to be replaced. The third reason why you might want to list your assets and capitalize, depreciate, and all of that is for your insurance company. So let's say that there is some sort of disaster, a fire, or, God forbid, a natural disaster, something of that nature, and you're working with your insurance company. It's a lot easier to pull out a spreadsheet that says these are all of our major assets. It's right here on a list, and it helps in terms of getting those funds returned to you or given to you through your insurance company versus trying to scramble to do that at that time. So those are three reasons why you may want to consider it. Used to be the standard was about $500, anything bought over $500 that you would depreciate, but nowadays that's not the case. You'd be depreciating everything. It's pretty much $1,000 and up. You can really set your own policy on what you want to do with that, but we recommend $1,000 and then the other thing is you want to determine at the end of the year any fixed items on a balance sheet that maybe you sold or got rid of or gave away or you retired from use. And those things need to be removed from your fixed asset list and just to clean it up so that it's good to go for the next year. So hopefully that helps. You also want to keep a spreadsheet and receipts for all of your larger purposes. You can make a binder or something of that nature and just always keep them on hand. So that's a good practice to do. And then finally, under the financial tasks, you want to review your insurance policies for the year. You really want to think through your coverage amounts. I mean, this is probably happening through the year. You're going to meet with your insurance agent. What do we need? What don't we need? That sort of thing. But just as a quick list here, you want to make sure you have property insurance. You want to have general liability insurance, and especially with a rider or additional, sexual abuse claim insurance. That's a big deal in churches right now, and so you're going to want to have a significant amount there. Also, your directors and officers coverage, which covers your board members from liability and workers' compensation, and then vehicle insurance if needed. Some of the things that you want to think about, and we don't have the time to get too much in the weeds on this, but you want to think about for especially your liability insurance. You ask yourself these questions like, does our insurance policy cover volunteers at events? Does it cover volunteers off-site? Maybe you have a VBS at a park or something. Does your liability insurance cover that? Does your liability insurance cover if there's a wreck, if a staff member is going to a meeting off-site? Those kinds of things. You just need to make sure that you're covered and that your insurance is very comprehensive. And I understand insurance is expensive. It's gotten more and more expensive, and especially property insurance. And here in California, it's kind of crazy with the fires, and it's even harder to get insurance, but it is certainly necessary, and it's really necessary to have good coverage because when you need it, you're really, really going to need it. So that's really it on the financial tasks that you need to be thinking about at the end of the year. Normally, this rolls over into January. A lot of these tasks are taken care of, but that's the financial side. Let's move on to payroll, which it's a little bit of a different animal with payroll, as probably all of you know when you deal with payroll. Now, some of you may be working with a payroll processor, so they do a lot of these things, or you may be doing it manually. Now, if you're working with a payroll processor, this has been my experience that while a payroll processor can do most all of these things, file your taxes for you and all of that, they don't always understand churches completely. And sometimes you need to explain that to them and help them to get there. And we've had all kinds of glitches with different payroll providers that they don't understand that in California, even though you don't have unemployment insurance or a state disability, that you still have to file a DE-9 with zeros on it. And so, we had a lot of back and forth with the payroll processor on that. So there are these very, detailed minutia kinds of things that sometimes they miss that we have to remind them and ask them to make sure to take care of. But we'll head into some of the things that you need to know about payroll for the end of the year. First of all, we always recommend that you verify employee information. And that's really just to confirm your employees' information, their social security, well, not their social security, but their address and phone number, that sort of thing, and their emergency contact info. You want to make sure that you have a file for every employee. And in that file, you want to make sure to have IRS Form I-9 it is an IRS regulation that you always have a copy of that for every employee on hand. It could be electronic or in a physical file, but you do need to have the I-9. That's the form that verifies a person's right to work in the United States and has the verification of a driver's license or passport or that sort of thing. And so that does need to be available if, not that it ever happens. I've never heard of this happening, but they always say if an IRS agent walked in, identified themselves, and checked your employee files, that those should be there. So again, never heard of it, but you always want to have that just in case. Also, every year you want to update your employees' W-4 forms. Those are the forms that they list the standard withholding or the voluntary withholding. Now, this is an important form, and let me just take just a moment. I know we're getting close on time here, but just a moment to explain about voluntary withholding. As most of you know, pastors get a housing allowance, and in that, they don't have to pay personal income tax. Also, pastors are excluded from mandatory deductions. You do not have to make deductions and pay their Social Security and Medicare. So if a pastor has not opted out of Social Security and Medicare, they still have to pay that. Normally, that's going to be quarterly tax deposits for the pastor to have to make. That is a pain for them. That's a pain point for them. Like, oh, I have to send this in quarterly, save my money and all of that. Well, they can do voluntary deductions or withholding, and that be sent into the IRS. And how that would work is you would look at the Social Security amount that needs to be calculated. By the way, on a housing allowance, they still have to pay Social Security and Medicare. They're only exempt from personal income tax. So you would take that total salary package that they have to pay the Social Security and Medicare on, multiply it by 15.3%. Then you can divide that by number of payrolls, which would be probably 24, 26, depending on your payroll cycle. And then they can list that as voluntary withholding. And so you can take that out for them, make it very convenient for them. So hopefully that's helpful to you. You can set that up with your payroll processor or do it manually, but you do need to have the W-4 completed. I think it's line 4C on that form. And then you just put in that amount that they want withheld. And then you go ahead and set that up for processing. Then you also want to make sure that those employee files have all of the necessary forms that are needed. You might have other things like signing an employee handbook or a conflict of interest form or those kinds of things that you want to update your employee files and make sure you have everything needed. And then the next thing is processing final payroll. So there's going to be a final payroll that you do possibly on December 31st, or I'm not sure if that falls on a weekend or not, but wherever that falls, there's going to be a last day. Why is this important? Sometimes you have extra things that need to go into a final payroll for the year. For example, if you pay out any PTO amounts or you pay out bonuses to staff, that would be there. Here's one that kind of hits sometimes is that whenever you have an employer retirement plan, sometimes employees want to make a little bit of an extra contribution to that plan at the end of the year. Now, you don't want to wait till December 30th to find that out. We've had that happen before with some of our ministries. So we put out a thing to all of our clients that says, well, if you want to add or make any changes, you need to get us that information by December 15th. And so if it's an employer-sponsored plan, it has to run through payroll. So sometimes folks feel like, well, I got until, April 15th to make that contribution. Well, that's only if it's a personal IRA or a personal, let's say Roth IRA or whatever it might be. Anything that's employer related has to run through payroll in the calendar year, has to be done by the end of the year. So that's why it is important to just think that through. Then let's look at the next one is reviewing and issuing IRS Form W-2s and 1099-Cs. Let's start with W-2s. W-2s, that's pretty self-explanatory. That would likely be generated from your payroll processor. However, there's one little thing that a lot of payroll processors miss, and that is for housing allowances. That must be expressed on box 14, the total housing allowance for the year. And I have seen several payroll processors miss that, and they have to redo their W-2. So it might be worth a quick call or some to your payroll processor, make sure that that is going to be on there. Or if they send you a sample before they send it out, sometimes they provide that, review that, make sure box 14 has the housing allowance there Otherwise, there's going to be issues and you have to reissue W-2s later, which that is never any fun. The other thing is 1099-NECs. NEC stands for non-employee compensation. So you want to make sure to send those out to any independent contractors you work with. That might be a gardener or plumber you worked with, or sometimes it's going to be musicians in the church, or other teachers, or folks that came in and you give them an honorarium, that sort of a thing. You need to issue 1099s. Now, the key with 1099s is that if it's $600 or less, you do not have to issue them. If it's over $600, then you do need to issue a 1099 NEC to that individual. And I can only speak for California, that's where we live, but they're getting more and more strict in their definition of who is an independent contractor and who should be an employee. So you have to be careful with that. If somebody has a business, and let's say a plumber or gardener, it's pretty plain who that is. By the way, with 1099 NECs, you do not have to send them to anyone who is incorporated. And so if they are a corporation or even an LLC, you don't have to. Or if it's another church who is a 501c3, you don't have to send anything to them either. It's only individuals that would have, just a sole proprietor business, that sort of a thing. That's where it's necessary. So make sure to review in whatever state you're in, the rules and regulations. Even go to the IRS, and you can just simply type in Google IRS regulations regarding independent contractor versus employee, and you can read that. It is getting stickier and stickier, though, to say that musicians and others that do certain things. Let's say you pay a musician $200 a month to sing, or that sort of a thing. It's $2,400 a year. They would need to be issued that. But I know in California, they really look at that differently with their ABC rule. By the way, if you're in California, just Google AB5, California's ABC rule for independent contractors, and you'll get the information there, and that'll help you make those decisions. But I think what's happening is if you need to err on any side, it's go ahead and make them an employee, and you'll just be a lot safer. But you need to make that call yourself. All right, let's move along to the next slide. Next up is reconciling your payroll accounts. So I already touched on this. These are going to be your liability accounts, medical, dental, vision, insurance, retirement, state withholding, federal tax withholding accounts. You want to make sure all of those are zeroed out at the end of the year, and there's not any straggling, pennies or a couple of dollars here and there. Just make sure that goes to zero, and don't let that hang out for years and years and years down the road. You also want to review the housing allowance for any of your pastoral staff, ministers. It is important that every year that your board approves the housing allowance for your ministers. Then that's whether they change it or it's exactly the same. You want to make sure that you are approving that. Now that can be approved from a document standpoint one of two ways. Either a letter that goes into their file that's on letterhead, or it can just be simply in the minutes for the board meeting that they approved, all of these housing allowances and the amount. And if you need something to help you to calculate that, or help your ministers to calculate it, you can go online and look up some housing allowance calculation sheets, and there's a lot of things that you can look at and download there. And then the next point is to file quarterly and annual payroll tax returns. You're probably already filing 941s on a quarterly basis. Obviously, do the December 941. The one that sometimes gets missed, especially if you're doing manual payroll, is IRS Form 940, which is FUTA, the federal unemployment tax. You want to make sure to do that. And then also any state forms that need to be input. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next one. We're almost done with payroll here. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. I know we're running out of time. There's so many things. Annual benefits renewal, open enrollment. So this is the time of year when you get to do that fun task, and your insurance company will work with you, give you the new information. You want to work with your employees to do that. Typically, that needs to be done by the end of November. Hopefully, you're already in the process. But then usually it needs to be turned in by December 1st because most insurance companies need 30 days to get all of that process. But just making sure that you're assisting and helping your staff get that information. And then, real important, that's kind of tied into that, is update your payroll systems. Because what's going to happen is as of January 1, the insurance amounts are going to change. They may elect different retirement amounts that they want to contribute, or your employees may change their W-4, their withholding requirements. So you want to update your payroll software, make sure everything is input correctly before your first payroll run. So if that's the 15th of January, make sure you take care of that before then. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're in compliance with all new laws. And so, a couple of simple Google searches, new federal laws, new state laws related to employees. You want to check that out. Give you an example. In California, as of January 1, the minimum wage goes to $16 an hour for all employees. And so many ministries have to kind of move that around because some of their staff are paid minimum wage. So you need to make sure that that's taken care of. The other thing that is a regulation that you should have is to purchase and display labor law posters in a prominent area in your office. Usually it's like the break room or something of that nature. But you do want to have those. And so there's companies that do offer that. They can provide that for you. You can purchase for, usually doesn't cost too much. You can kind of shop around on that. But get those posters, put them up. You need to do that every January and update them because the laws do change. All right, so finally, we're going to head into the general administrative tasks. And so I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly here. You want to update leadership and board changes. So sometimes a treasurer leaves or even a president leaves and there's a new treasurer that comes on or a new signer. This is very important for your bank signature cards, your investment signature cards, maybe your credit cards as well, that you change those officers. And you don't want to have somebody move out of state and it's 4 years later and you didn't take care of it. And then all of a sudden you got to try to track a person down and get signatures and all that. It gets to be a little bit hairy there, but just, check all the accounts that might need to be changing if you have a significant change in your leadership. Second, reviewing vendor contracts. Some vendor contracts are annual. They may need to be renegotiated. Your lease might be coming up for your copier. You may want to renegotiate that. Sometimes things as simple as your internet provider. You might want to review that. Sometimes a phone call, you'll get a good deal for 6 months, half off or something like that. So just a good time to reassess that. And then third, your annual meeting and reporting. Most churches have an annual meeting where they'll report their finances to the church. And my recommendation there is to keep it not so much about finances. You're going to share some key data, some high level things, but keep it more towards the vision. What did we accomplish this last year? What did God do through us? And what are we doing next year? And that sort of thing. And make it more of an upbeat meeting rather than just dollars and cents, and that's all you're looking at. And then finally, review and update your policies. So this would include things like your employee handbook may need to be updated. It could be your financial policies, your conflict of interest policies, anything of those or of that nature, you may want to review and make sure that you're compliant and up to date on it. So that was a lot to cover. But here's where I shared at the beginning that we do have a checklist for you to download. And so we want to provide this to you free of charge. And so there's the link. You just go to gsbooks.org/end of year checklist. Make sure to put those dashes between end of and year and checklist to get there. But you can write that down. Go there. There's a PDF link there. You can download these and print them. I will share one other thing that we're going to open up for questions, and that is if you are needing someone, you might have a volunteer that does your books or you do the books on staff, but you don't have someone to do any kind of oversight or that second set of or pair of eyes that I mentioned earlier. We do offer something called Oversight Light, where we can do the reconciliation and issue financial reports. That's all we do. It's much less than if you were doing full bookkeeping services for us, so you can do all of that. And we just help to oversee, and we run it through a triple peer QC where the bookkeeper does it, and then it goes to a team leader and a manager. So you get 3 sets of eyes actually looking at it. So you can reach out to us if you're interested in something like that that could be helpful. and we're happy to provide that. So with that, we'll go ahead and open up for some questions. I'm not sure how much time we have left, Tim, and I'm sorry it took so long, but there's just a lot of information here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob. Great information. There are a couple of questions. The first question, though, is what's the best way to get a hold of you if someone is interested in diving deeper on any of these things, or, for your services? What's the best way to
Yeah,
contact you?
best way is just email me at bob@gsbooks.org.
Great.
It's bob@gsbooks.org. Yeah.
And I just want to encourage everyone. We've worked with Bob for a long time. We have a partnership with him. We ministries that have used him have always said great things. So Bob does a great job. So just wanted to give you a little bit of encouragement there. Real quick, couple of questions that came up in the question and answer, and this one's actually a multi-part question. And this was in terms of in-kind donations. And the question was, the CPA wants us to book an entry for this in our financials, right? Do we only record things that we use for operations? Or is it broader than that? And then the next question is there a minimum limit? And then how do we determine the value of each item donated? Do we ask the donors, or is there some other way to do that?
Yeah. So for the first question, yeah, in terms of booking, sometimes people just give like children's ministry supplies and little things here and there. I don't think you're going to need to worry a lot about that. Technically, though, you should book in-kind donations, and you can even have a separate line item where you may know the value of it. You need to put it in your books as whatever the value was, like if they give you a copy of the receipt or something like that. But you may have under your income section on your P&L, you could have in-kind donations. So anytime that comes in, you just book that as income that came in under in-kind donations. So that would be the way to handle that. As far as the minimum amount, I'm not sure if there is a minimum amount. It may be the 250 still. I would probably lean into that, but I'd need to verify that for you. But probably if it's under 250, then I don't think you need to worry about it. Over 250, you need to give them a letter. And I'm sorry, Tim, what was the third part of that question?
I think it was the determining the value. How do we determine the value?
Oh, best case would be if they gave you a receipt and or showed you a receipt. They give you a copy of a receipt. You're still not going to put the value on the letter if it's over 250, but that helps you to know what you need to book. And so you can ask them for that.
Okay, great. Good answer. Next question. What is obviously this list is a creature of all kinds of experience, right? And different things. What's the thing that maybe ministries forget the most, or the thing that is the most problematic in all of this year-end stuff that causes problems for ministries?
Wow, that's a great question. I would say some of the things that are forgotten are the reconciliation of the payroll liabilities, reconciling all of those accounts and making sure that, when you close the books at the end of the year, that they're as pristine as possible. I kind of liken it to, sometimes we do cleanups, and we've done that with some of CCCU's clients who come in for a loan. It's like, wow, these financials are kind of unwieldy here. And so we'll clean them up and get them all set. But it's amazing because we find transactions going back 5 years, 7 years, whatever, that have to be dealt with and cleaned up because they didn't clean it up at that time. And it's almost like this tree that just gets overgrown, has never been pruned. And I liken it to that Bible story that Jesus told, that sometimes there needs to be pruning, right? To cut back the dead weight and all of that so that there can be new growth. And so that's how a chart of accounts is sometimes. We'll look at chart of accounts, it'll be like, 150 different accounts. You don't need all of that. Try to keep it as simple as possible. But I'd say that's probably the big thing, is just letting it, not dealing with it. Out of sight, out of mind. I don't want to deal with it. And then it ends up catching up to you at some point. That's probably the most neglected. Other things, if you don't do things or send forms to the IRS, you're going to get a letter in the mail. So that's going to remind you, right? So those things you will be reminded. But it's more of the maintenance thing, and even the maintenance things like your handbooks. It's like that stuff we just don't want to deal with. But if you keep up with it each year, then maybe it's a little more tweaking as opposed to a full recreation.
Yeah. Yeah, I can speak as a banker, and you as a fellow banker, I'm sure the reconciliation from period to period on your financials is one of the most important things, in terms of your financial presentation to a third party, right?
Yeah.
And as a lender, one of those things is the first thing that we look at when we say, okay, what does it look from year to year? Is the cash where we think it's supposed to be, right? And do they make sense from year to year? And so, I would iterate as a banker as well. That's really, really important for sure.
Yeah.
Another really important question is what's Bob's favorite side dish at Thanksgiving? And that's really
My
this is
favorite.
on the Q&A, so we got to answer this.
Oh my word. My favorite side dish. I gotta say, man, that's hard. It probably the mashed potatoes and gravy.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm a stuffing guy myself, but
Yeah,
I don't mind the mashed potatoes either.
yeah.
So good stuff, good stuff. Um, I don't see any other questions outstanding. And Bob, is there anything that you feel like we need to add here in the last few moments?
No, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm happy to get back to you. It's again bob@gsbooks.org, and if we can be of assistance in any way, we're happy to help you. Our desire is to help ministries flourish, and so we love doing that. And so reach out to us if we can help. Make sure to get that checklist link there and go and download that. We hope that's a valuable tool for you, and we wish you the best and pray you have a wonderful rest of your year and an excellent 2025 as you head into that.